When you pray, you are not performing a religious routine, you are making a supernatural connection. Prayer is the bridge between heaven's authority and earth's reality. It's the divine line that connects a weak human to an all-powerful God. Many people treat prayer as a ritual, a moment to say a few words and move on. But when you truly understand what prayer does, you realize it's the most powerful weapon you have. Prayer is not about impressing God with fancy words. It's about inviting His power to invade your situation. When you open your mouth in faith, you open the door for God to move in ways that your strength, your logic, and your resources never could. Prayer connects you to the source, just as a lamp cannot shine unless it's plugged into the outlet. You cannot walk in victory unless you're plugged into God through prayer. Many believers are trying to shine in the dark, trying to fight battles disconnected from their power supply. That's why life feels heavy and victory seems distant. But the moment you pray, you reconnect to divine energy. You remind yourself and every force around you that you are not standing alone. You are standing with heaven's backing. The power that raised Jesus from the dead becomes active in your situation the moment you call on His name. When you pray, you step into a partnership with the Almighty. God does not need your strength, He desires your surrender. He invites you into a place where your natural ability ends and His supernatural begins. Prayer is not about convincing God to do what you want. It's about aligning yourself with what He already wants to do in your life. The moment you pray according to His will, heaven begins to move. You may not see it instantly, but the unseen realm shifts the moment you say, "Father, I need you." Prayer positions you under the flow of God's power, and once you're in that flow, no enemy can stop what God has started. Prayer also builds confidence. When you pray, you remember who God is and who you are in Him. Fear begins to lose its grip because you realize you're not depending on your own strength. The same God who parted the Red Sea, who shut the mouths of lions, who walked through fire with the 3 Hebrew boys, that same God listens to you when you pray. And when you realize that truth, boldness rises. You begin to pray differently, live differently, and expect differently. Every time you pray, something happens. You might not see it, but in the spiritual realm, chains are breaking, doors are opening, and angels are moving on assignment. The power of prayer is not limited by distance, time, or circumstance. It reaches places your hands can't touch and changes hearts your words can't reach. That's why prayer must be your first response, not your last resort. Before you pick up the phone, pick up your faith. Before you complain, call on the name of the Lord, because when you connect through prayer, you connect to power, and when you're connected to God's power, nothing you've lost is beyond recovery. When you pray, you invite God to step into the areas of your life where loss has taken residence. Prayer becomes the instrument through which restoration flows. The enemy's goal has always been to steal, kill, and destroy your joy, your peace, your relationships, your purpose. But what the enemy doesn't understand is that prayer is heaven's recovery system. Every time you go before God in prayer, you are activating His power to restore what has been taken. You are saying, "Lord, I may have lost it, but I still believe you can bring it back." In the natural, when something is lost, we panic, search, and sometimes give up if we don't find it. But in the spiritual realm, loss is never final when prayer is involved. God doesn't just replace what was lost, He multiplies it. Think of Job, a man who suffered unimaginable loss. He lost his health, his wealth, his children, and his reputation. His world was shattered, yet in the midst of his pain, Job didn't curse God or surrender to despair. He prayed, and when he prayed, God began to turn his story around. The same God who allowed the test became the God who restored double what was lost. That's what prayer does. It turns ashes into beauty, mourning into dancing, and loss into gain. When you pray, you remind the enemy that he doesn't get the last word. The devil may have stolen something from you, but through prayer you reclaim authority. You declare that the loss will not define you. Prayer gives you divine permission to reach into the unseen and pull restoration into your reality. It shifts your focus from what you lost to who God is, the restorer of broken things. And when your eyes are fixed on the restorer, you stop mourning over what was and start expecting what will be. Prayer also restores what loss tries to destroy on the inside of you. Loss doesn't just take things, it drains hope, faith, and confidence. It makes you question whether God still sees you, but when you pray, your spirit begins to heal. God doesn't just give you back possessions, He gives you back peace. He renews your strength and your sense of purpose. He reminds you that even though something left your hands, it never left His control. What prayer restores first is your connection to Him, and once that's restored, everything else can follow. Sometimes restoration doesn't come in the exact form you expect. You might not get back the same opportunity, relationship, or position, but prayer ensures that what comes next will be greater. God never gives back the same, He gives back better. The latter glory always exceeds the former. When you pray, you allow God to rewrite your story with increase. So even when it looks like you've lost too much, don't lose your prayer, because prayer keeps your restoration on schedule. The enemy may have taken something, but he cannot hold it when heaven starts moving on your behalf. Through prayer, God takes the broken pieces of your past and builds something stronger, something richer, something redeemed. Prayer has a way of changing how you see things long before it changes the things themselves. When you come before God in prayer, you're not just speaking words into the air. You're entering a space where your perspective begins to shift. You may start praying with fear, frustration, or confusion, but as you stay in His presence, something starts to happen inside you. The weight begins to lift, your thoughts begin to clear, and what once looked impossible starts to look conquerable. Prayer doesn't just move God, it moves you. It changes how you see your problem, how you see yourself, and how you see your God. So often, we get trapped in how things look. We stare at the loss, the pain, the delay, and the disappointment until our faith starts to shrink. We allow what we see to dictate how we feel, but prayer interrupts that cycle. It takes your eyes off the problem and fixes them on the one who holds the solution. When you pray, you stop magnifying the issue and start magnifying God. That's what perspective is. It's not denial of reality. It's the reordering of focus. Prayer lifts you higher so you can see clearer. What looked like a mountain starts to look like a stepping stone when viewed from heaven's point of view. Prayer is the place where despair turns into expectation. You may enter prayer saying, "I don't know how I'm going to make it," but you leave saying, "If God is for me, who can be against me?" That's a perspective shift. Prayer strengthens your inner vision until you see beyond your present pain. It helps you understand that what feels like loss might actually be positioning. Sometimes God allows things to be removed not to punish you, but to prepare you. But you'll never see that until you pray. Prayer gives you the spiritual clarity to discern God's hand even when His plan doesn't make sense. When you pray, peace begins to guard your mind. The noise of anxiety and doubt gets silenced because you realize God is still in control. That's why prayer is essential. It recalibrates your heart. It reminds you that no matter how chaotic life becomes, there's a throne that never shakes and a God who never changes. Once your perspective is renewed, you stop responding out of panic and start walking by faith. You stop saying, "Why me?" and start saying, "Lord, what are you teaching me?" That's the transformation prayer produces. Prayer is also a mirror. It reveals what's really happening inside of you. Sometimes the greatest shift happens not in your situation, but in your attitude. You start to see where fear has been ruling, where bitterness has taken root, and where unbelief has crept in. In prayer, God doesn't just fix what's around you. He fixes what's within you. And once your heart changes, your outlook changes. So, even if your situation hasn't yet turned around, you walk out of prayer with a new perspective, stronger, steadier, and anchored in faith, because now you see it through God's eyes, not your own. There are moments in life when everything around you seems lifeless. Dreams you once held dear begin to fade. Relationships crumble. Faith grows weary, and hope feels like a distant memory. It's in those moments that prayer becomes the breath that revives what looks dead. Prayer is not just communication with God, it's divine resuscitation. It breathes the life of heaven into situations that have been written off by man. When you pray, you are inviting resurrection power to move. You are calling on the same God who spoke to dry bones through Ezekiel, saying, "Can these bones live?" And when Ezekiel obeyed and spoke God's word, life returned to what was scattered and dry. Prayer works the same way. It speaks life where there's been loss, and suddenly what was dead begins to stir again. Sometimes what looks dead isn't dead. It's just dormant, waiting for prayer to awaken it. The enemy loves to make you believe it's over, that the dream won't rise again, that the promise won't be fulfilled, that the heart once broken can never heal. But prayer challenges that lie. Prayer says, "Not so fast." It declares that as long as there is breath in your body and God on his throne, nothing is too far gone. Prayer releases faith into the atmosphere, and faith is the oxygen that lifeless things need to breathe again. When you start praying over what you thought was finished, you are making a prophetic statement that says, "This story isn't over." Prayer revives not only situations, but also the believer's spirit. Sometimes the thing that dies first is not the dream, but the desire to dream again. You lose passion, energy, or belief because of repeated disappointments. But prayer rekindles that inner fire. It turns spiritual ashes into flame. As you pray, God begins to stir your heart, remind you of his promises, and renew your expectation. Suddenly, you begin to hope again, believe again, and act again. Prayer transforms you from a mourner to a mover, from one who grieves the past to one who prepares for what's coming. In prayer, you also learn that revival doesn't always happen instantly. Sometimes God brings things back to life in stages, little by little, layer by layer. Just like when Jesus called Lazarus from the tomb, the miracle happened in steps. First the word was spoken, then the dead man responded, then he was unwrapped. In the same way, prayer sets the process of resurrection in motion. You may not see full restoration immediately, but every prayer you pray is a breath of life moving through what was lifeless. When you choose to pray over dead things, you are declaring your trust in a living God. You're saying, "Lord, I don't care what it looks like. I know you specialize in bringing life out of loss." And when God breathes, nothing stays buried. Through prayer, what was lifeless finds strength again. What was silent begins to sing again, and what was broken starts to build again. When you take time to pray, you do more than ask God for help. You open yourself to receive his divine strategy. Prayer doesn't just bring comfort, it brings clarity. Many people want breakthrough but skip the process of seeking direction. They rush into decisions, react to emotions, or try to fix things in their own wisdom, only to find themselves going in circles. But prayer stops that cycle. It slows you down long enough to hear the still, small voice of God giving specific instruction for your situation. Heaven has a strategy for every storm, but you'll only discover it when you make space to listen. When you pray, you're saying, God, I don't just need you to move, I need you to show me how to move. That's what separates spiritual maturity from religious routine. Prayer is not just talking, it's tuning in, it's allowing God to reveal steps, timing, and order. In Scripture, we see this pattern again and again. Before David went to battle, he would inquire of the Lord. He didn't rely on yesterday's victories. He sought a fresh strategy for today's challenge. And when David prayed, God gave him instructions that led to victory. The same principle applies to us. Prayer positions us to receive guidance that human reasoning could never provide. God's strategies often don't look logical. He told Joshua to march around Jericho instead of attacking it. He told Gideon to reduce his army instead of expanding it. He told Peter to cast his net on the other side after a night of failure. Each of those commands defied logic, yet they carried divine wisdom. When you pray, God reveals insights that may not make sense to the natural mind, but carry supernatural results. Prayer gives you the courage to obey even when the instruction feels uncomfortable, because you know the voice you're following isn't your own. It's the voice of the one who sees the end from beginning. Prayer also teaches you timing. Sometimes the problem isn't that you're doing the wrong thing, it's that you're doing the right thing too soon. Through prayer, God not only tells you what to do, but when to do it. He teaches patience, discipline, and discernment. The waiting season becomes a training ground, not a wasted one. You begin to realize that divine strategy requires divine timing, and prayer is the place where the two align. When you pray long enough, you start to recognize that every move God makes has purpose. Nothing is random. He may close a door to redirect your steps towards something greater. He may delay an answer to develop your dependence on Him. But without prayer, you'd miss those details. Prayer reveals patterns, principles, and plans hidden from ordinary sight. It turns confusion into clarity and chaos into order. You stop guessing and start walking in confidence because you know you're being led by divine direction, not human impulse. That's the beauty of prayer. It doesn't just change outcomes. It reveals strategies that guarantee victory. Prayer is the declaration of victory before the battle is even over. It's the language of faith that speaks triumph while standing in the middle of trial. When you pray, you are not reacting to what you see. You are responding to what you know, that God is faithful, powerful, and undefeated. Prayer is your way of saying, I may not see the end yet, but I already know who wins. It's not about ignoring the storm, it's about trusting the one who controls it. The world says, I'll believe it when I see it. But prayer says, I'll see it because I believe it. That's the posture of a victorious believer. When you begin to pray from a place of victory, your words shift. You stop begging and start declaring. You stop praying from fear and start praying from faith. You stop asking, Lord, will you? And start saying, Lord, thank you because you already have. Victory prayer is not timid, it's confident. It recognizes that Jesus has already conquered death, sin, and every force of darkness. So when you pray, you're not fighting for victory, you're praying from victory. You're enforcing what Christ already won. The cross wasn't a partial win, it was a total triumph. Prayer simply activates that finished work in your situation. In the Bible, when Paul and Silas were thrown into prison, they didn't wait for freedom to praise. They praised while still in chains. Their prayer and worship were acts of victory before the miracle happened. They didn't say, we'll sing after we're released. They sang in advance, and that praise caused the foundations of the prison to shake. That's what victorious prayer does. It shakes things in the spiritual realm until what's bound becomes free. The walls may still be standing when you start praying, but they can't remain when faith is released. Prayer that declares victory also protects your heart. It keeps you steady when life's battles intensify. It reminds you that defeat is temporary, but God's promises are eternal. When you pray with confidence, you're reinforcing the truth that no weapon formed against you shall prosper. You're aligning your spirit with heaven's verdict, not earth's report. Victory prayer doesn't deny the pain, it just refuses to let pain have the final say. It stands tall in the middle of the storm and proclaims, God is still good, and I will see his deliverance. This kind of prayer changes the atmosphere. It fills your environment with expectation instead of fear. It causes the enemy to tremble because he knows a believer who prays from victory is unstoppable. You begin to thank God not after the blessing comes, but while you're still waiting, because gratitude itself becomes warfare. Every thank you speak is a weapon. Every word of faith is a declaration that says, the outcome is already settled. Prayer declares victory before the battle ends because faith sees beyond the present moment. It believes that even if the situation hasn't changed yet, God has already written the final chapter and it ends in victory.